What really happened to T.I.? It will shock you. In 2008, T.I. was untouchable Radio King Grammy winner, Atlanta's pride. Then almost overnight, the same man who shouted King of the South walked into federal court in handcuffs. No warning, no slow decline, just a brutal drop that left fans frozen and the media scrambling for answers. How does a superstar fall that fast? And what was happening behind the fame that most people still don't understand? Stay with me because this story isn't a rumor. It's a real chain of choices, consequences, and survival. If you love deep truths about Black icons, hit subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence right now. Rise and sudden fall. In 2008, T.I., born Clifford Tip Harris Jr., looked unstoppable. After years of grinding out of Atlanta's Bankhead, he wasn't just a rapper with momentum, he was a national figure. His songs didn't stay in hip-hop lanes anymore. They drifted into office radios, backyard cookouts, and the quiet hum of evening commutes. Live Your Life played like a victory parade you couldn't escape, and the nickname King of the South felt less like a boast and more like a headline the country agreed with. For a lot of fans, especially older listeners watching from the outside, T.I. represented something simple and powerful. A man who had climbed from chaos into comfort, who had turned street survival into mainstream success. Then came the whiplash. In 2009, not long after that dizzying high, America watched the same superstar walk into federal court in handcuffs. The cameras caught a different T.I. head lowered, jaw tight, swagger gone. One season, he was the polished star in designer shades owning award show stages. The next, he was standing before a judge flanked by marshals carrying the weight of a case that suddenly dwarfed the hits. It didn't feel like a slow decline you could see coming. It felt like a sudden blackout at the height of the concert, like a trapdoor opening under a throne. No one thought could wobble, much less fall. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was its own storm. Fans split instantly, some furious at the system, some disappointed in their hero, many simply stunned into silence. Call-in shows lit up with bewildered voices. People who had played his music for their kids now wondered what lesson the headlines were teaching. Critics rushed in to say the crown had always been fragile. Supporters pushed back, insisting that one case shouldn't erase a decade of work. The media magnified the drama with fallen king banners replaying the walk to court like a looped warning about fame and consequences. And in the middle of all that noise stood a single uncomfortable truth. Nobody had expected this. Not this fast. That disbelief is exactly where this opening chapter keeps you leaning forward. Before the story even digs into charges, deals, or timelines, the first shock is speed. It starts with the glow of 2008 and slams into the cold reality of 2009 without warning, forcing you to feel the drop in your stomach. It asks you to sit in the uneasy space between the man on stage and the man in cuffs, between celebration and consequence. How does a superstar go from anthem to indictment in what feels like a heartbeat? Whatever the answer is, the fall happens so quickly that you can't look away. And that's the hook. The crown was real, the spotlight was blinding, and then suddenly the lights went out. Bankhead beginnings. T.I.'s story doesn't begin with flashbulbs or Grammys. It begins in 1980 in Atlanta's Center Hill area right by Bankhead, a place where the soundtrack wasn't luxury cars, but sirens and gunshots. For many Americans who only met him on the radio years later, it's easy to miss how wide that distance is. Bankhead was the kind of neighborhood where a child learned the rules of survival before the rules of grammar, where danger wasn't a headline, but a normal night outside your window. In that world, you didn't grow up in a straight line. You zigzagged around trouble, hoping you'd live long enough to choose something better. He was raised largely in his grandparents' small home, a tight, watchful household sitting inside that rough zip code. The adults around him weren't celebrities or executives. They were family trying to keep food on the table and a kid alive. Walk a couple blocks and you might see drug deals in plain daylight, a reality nobody bothered to hide. Kids didn't go searching for trouble. Trouble was already on the porch. By the time most boys were worried about homework or Little League, Tip was learning how to read faces, how to stay quiet, and when to move fast. The streets were a classroom with harsh teachers, and every lesson came with consequences. Rap became his escape hatch, not because it was trendy, but because it felt like oxygen. While other kids were learning spelling words, he was learning bars, writing rhymes like diary entries, turning fear into rhythm. Music gave him a way to speak back to a life that kept trying to shrink him. By 12 or 13, he was already pulled toward street corners, keeping watch, brushing against the hustling world that had swallowed older kids he knew. Before he turned 15, he'd been arrested multiple times. That isn't a heroic badge. It's proof of how early the pressure started. Yet those arrests didn't mute him. They sharpened him, giving his voice that gritty honesty people would later call real. So when the world eventually called him the King of the South, it wasn't just about hits or swagger. It was about survival. The boy from Bankhead wasn't dreaming of fame the way suburban kids do. He was dreaming of escape of a road that didn't end in a cell or a grave. Rap offered a third door, one he could kick open with talent and nerve. You can hear that urgency in his earliest work. This wasn't art for art's sake, it was a lifeline. His childhood didn't guarantee success, but it forged the hunger discipline and raw edge that made success possible. And that forged in fire core is what makes the later rise and the later fall hit so hard. Early deal, early setback. T.I. didn't enter the rap game through a golden door. He slipped in through a side alley, hungry and half ignored, carrying the sharp edge of Bankhead in his voice. By the late 90s, he was a teenager rapping anywhere someone would listen: parking lots, block parties, tiny studios that smelled like sweat and cheap coffee. He wasn't a polished product yet. He was a survivor with a story. That relentless grind is what finally put him in front of Kawan KP Prather, a respected producer with ties to LaFace and Arista. KP didn't just hear talent. He heard a new Southern voice that sounded urgent, lived in, and impossible to fake. With KP backing him, Tip signed to Arista and released his debut album, I'm Serious, in 2001. On paper, it looked like the dream young artists pray for: label money, national distribution, recognizable features, a real promotional push. But reality didn't cooperate. The album struggled in the market, never climbed into the top tier, and didn't produce a signature hit that could force the country to pay attention. Critics shrugged. Industry veterans laughed at the bold kid who was already calling himself the King of the South. In a business addicted to instant winners, Arista lost patience fast. Within a year, the same deal that felt like escape turned into a trapdoor. They figured that was curtains. Tip didn't. He went back to Atlanta, linked arms with his close partner Jason Geter, and built something the majors couldn't cancel: Grand Hustle Records. Forget glossy offices. Grand Hustle was a street-level war room. They pressed mixtapes, worked the club circuit, and treated every DJ, promoter, and barbershop speaker like a billboard. Night after night, T.I.'s music traveled hand to hand, car to car, block to block. He wasn't begging for the industry to validate him anymore. He was making the city validate him first, because he knew the South had always been his real engine. And Atlanta responded. The mixtapes built heat like a slow fire, and by 2003, the rest of America finally felt it. T.I.'s verse on Never Scared hit like a siren, announcing that the guy Arista tossed aside was still standing and sharper than before. When trap music dropped soon after, it didn't sound like a comeback plea. It sounded like a blueprint for a new Southern era. The same system that had dismissed him now had to chase him, and the world started to realize the shocking truth: T.I.'s first failure wasn't the end of his career. It was the lesson that taught him how to win on his own terms. Becoming King of the South. By 2003, the comeback had turned into a takeover. After exploding on Never Scared, T.I. released trap music, and Atlanta stopped being a side note in hip-hop. It became the main stage. The album didn't just ride a wave, it helped name and shape it. His delivery was sharp, urgent, and proudly Southern, like somebody reporting from the block with a preacher's certainty. Songs such as 24's Be Easy and Rubber Band Man carried him from local hero to national contender. Club DJs, radio programmers, and fans far outside Georgia started treating his records like essential listening, not regional flavor. The momentum tightened into a run of undeniable albums. Urban Legend in 2004 proved he could grow without losing grit, landing him deeper in mainstream radio while keeping that bankhead bite. Each release felt like another step up the staircase. Bigger hooks, clearer focus, more authority. Then came 2006, the year The Crown stopped being a debate. King debuted at No. 1 on the Billboard 200, moving about 522,000 copies in its first week. What You Know turned into a thunderclap of an anthem, and suddenly his once mocked claim, King of the South, sounded less like ego and more like fact. What surprised people almost as much was how far beyond rap he stretched. T.I. walked onto the big screen in ATL, a film drenched in Atlanta youth culture. He wasn't doing a quick cameo. He carried a full role with the same grounded charisma he brought to records. That widened his audience to viewers who didn't follow mixtape chatter, and it told Hollywood he belonged there. His public image shifted from street rapper to full-spectrum entertainer, the kind of star who could headline a show Friday night and open a movie Saturday afternoon. Around the same time, elite producers started saluting him publicly. Pharrell Williams, famously selective with admiration, praised T.I. His stature and impact, treating him as the South's natural counterpart to the genre's top icons. Then the trophies made it official. In 2007, T.I. won his first Grammy for My Love, his collaboration with Justin Timberlake proving his reach could stretch into pop without snapping his identity. Picture the contrast, a kid from Bankhead who once dodged police lights now standing beside one of America's biggest pop stars, collecting music's highest prize. That rise, streets to charts to cinema to Grammys, is why the King of the South era felt so inevitable. It's also why when the crash came later, it felt almost impossible to believe. At this peak, T.I. wasn't just winning. He was defining the moment for the entire rap world. Tragedy and the gun case. At the very moment T.I. seemed to have everything chart dominance movie roles and a crown, the South had finally accepted life split open in the most brutal way. In May 2006, after an after-hours clash at Cincinnati's club Ritz, shots ripped through his convoy on Interstate 75 as his crew tried to get away. When the vans finally pulled over, his closest friend and personal assistant, Philaunt Big Phil Johnson, was dying from gun wounds. Big Phil wasn't just staff, he was brotherhood on payroll, the steady presence who had helped Tip survive the road and the pressure. Losing him didn't feel like a headline to T.I. It felt like the ground disappearing under his feet. From that night on, the King of the South carried a different shadow. Fame no longer felt like armor. It felt like a beacon for danger. T.I. started moving with an edge you could hear in his voice, watching corners, scanning crowds, calculating exits. Grief curdled into fear, and fear into a single, fateful idea. If violence could reach his inner circle, once it could reach it again. So he began stockpiling guns for self-defense, telling himself that firepower could protect his family and prevent another Philaunt from happening. It wasn't some cartoon villain turn. It was a traumatized man trying to control the uncontrollable and walking straight toward a legal cliff. That cliff arrived on October 13, 2007. Federal agents arrested T.I. in Atlanta during an ATF sting just hours before he was scheduled to headline the BET Hip Hop Awards. Prosecutors said his bodyguard had arranged to buy unregistered machine guns and silencers for him, and because T.I. was a convicted felon, he was prohibited from possessing firearms at all. Investigators also reported additional weapons in his vehicle and at his home. The headlines hit like a thunderclap. The same man who had ruled radio and award stages was now facing federal weapons charges with years of prison time on the table. T.I. pleaded guilty and accepted a deal that still felt like a hard fall from a very high place. In March 2009, a judge sentenced him to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison plus a $100, $300 fine and 500 hours of community service. That oddly specific year and a day mattered because it allowed early release for good behavior, but it didn't soften the optics America watched a superstar traded for an inmate number. Before reporting, he threw himself into service schools, shelters, youth talks, publicly warning kids about the exact road he'd taken, a journey documented in T.I.'s Road to Redemption. The shock in the title isn't a secret twist. It's the tragic math, a single death, a spiral of fear, one reckless choice, and a king brought down by trying to feel safe. First prison exile. When the prison gates closed behind T.I. in 2009, it wasn't just a legal sentence, it was a cultural vanishing act at the worst possible moment. Only a year earlier, he had been everywhere. Radio award stages, magazine covers, and movie screens. The man Atlanta proudly called its crown. Now he was a federal inmate in Forest City, Arkansas, trading tour buses for concrete walls. No flashbulbs, no stage lights, no crowd roar, just a narrow bunk and long nights to replay every choice that got him there. The fall felt even steeper because it came right after his peak, like watching a bright stadium go dark in the middle of the anthem. And hip-hop does not wait on anyone, not even a king. While T.I. sat in exile, the trap sound he helped pioneer was mutating in real time. Atlanta was still thumping, but younger voices were taking the wheel and pushing the genre into a new decade. On the national charts, Drake was rising like a tide, mixing rap with melody and confession so smoothly that he pulled in listeners who had never cared about regional loyalties. At nearly the same moment, Nicki Minaj erupted into a phenomenon, charismatic, technically fearless, and built for the internet age that was suddenly defining stardom. The music kept moving forward, and it moved without him. From inside, T.I. could feel that shift like a chill under the cell door. The radio space he once owned now belonged to another generation, and the conversations that used to orbit his name were drifting away. That's a special kind of loss for any artist, not being beaten by a rival, but being replaced by momentum. His first term lasted about 11 months, yet culturally it felt longer because it landed right on a turning point. When he went in, he was still a main character in hip-hop's story. When he was preparing to come out, the story's spotlight had already swung toward new faces and new formulas. So the real shock of this chapter isn't only that T.I. went to prison, it's what prison stole that a judge can't measure timing. The King of the South doesn't rule on past glory alone. He rules by being present when the beat changes. In 2009-2010, the beat changed fast. New stars, new sounds, and a new way of deciding who mattered. By the time T.I. stepped back into daylight in early 2010, he was walking into a landscape he had helped build but no longer controlled. The exile didn't erase his talent, but it eroded his throne, and it set up the next even harsher test of whether a fallen king could still find a way back. Release relapse. Return to prison. When T.I. walked out of prison in early 2010, the world felt wide open again. He spoke with humility, carried himself with intention, and moved as if he understood exactly how precious his second chance was. Fans were ready to welcome him back, the South especially. His voice returned to interviews, his presence returned to studios, and there was a flicker of electricity around his comeback. It wasn't the loud triumph of his mid-2000s dominance, but it was a hopeful restart, a reminder that a king can rise again if he chooses discipline over impulse. For a brief moment, it looked like T.I. was steering his story toward redemption instead of relapse. But the road back to the throne is a narrow one, and the slightest misstep can send you sliding. Just 6 months after his release in September 2010, the blue lights of a police cruiser cut through T.I.'s new beginning. In Los Angeles, officers stopped the car carrying him and his wife Tamika Tiny Cottle, claiming they smelled marijuana drifting from the windows. Inside, they discovered small amounts of controlled substances, hardly the kind of haul that makes national news, but enough to spark a firestorm for a man still on federal probation. What might have been a minor citation for someone else became a seismic shock for T.I. It was a direct violation of his release terms, the one line he couldn't afford to cross. And now he'd crossed it with cameras watching. The timing couldn't have been worse. Hip-hop was still shifting, still elevating new voices while T.I. was fighting to reclaim old ground. This second arrest didn't just interrupt his momentum, it shattered it. Headlines hardened. Commentators who once saw him as a symbol of resilience now painted him as a cautionary tale. The courts didn't hesitate either. After a probation hearing, the judge ordered him back to prison for 11 more months, a blow that landed heavier than the first. Because this time, he wasn't entering prison as a rising star who stumbled. He was entering as a man who had been given grace publicly repeatedly and lost hold of it. And in the entertainment world, perception is power. This second incarceration made T.I.'s image feel unstable, unreliable, even tragic to some of his most loyal supporters. While he sat behind bars through 2010 and into 2011, the cultural wave continued its march forward. New talent crowded the charts, new styles shaped the sound, and the digital age sped everything up. By the time he came home again, T.I. wasn't returning to the space he left. He was returning to a landscape that had quietly replaced him. The shock of this chapter isn't just that he slipped, but that the slip cost him time, trust, and the last chances the industry was willing to give. Reinvention and mainstream comeback. When T.I. walked out of prison at the end of 2011, he knew better than anyone that coming back as the same man wouldn't work. The world had changed, the charts had changed, and the culture had learned to move on without him. So instead of trying to force his old image back into the spotlight, he did something far smarter. He reinvented himself. One of his first steps was stepping into a world nobody expected from the king of the South Family Television. T.I. and Tiny. The Family Hustle, co-starring his wife Tiny Cottle, presented him in a light America had never seen patient father, steady husband, mentor to his kids. The show softened edges that prison headlines had sharpened, showing viewers the man behind the mistakes. For older American audiences, especially parents and grandparents, it rebuilt something far more valuable than hype trust. But T.I. didn't stop at image repair. He attacked the music landscape with strategy, not nostalgia. Instead of clinging to his early 2000s sound, he tapped directly into the young generation, shaping hip-hop's next chapter. His comeback philosophy was simple: don't compete with youth, collaborate with it. That approach paid off almost immediately. In 2012, he teamed up with Lil Wayne for Ball, a lively, horn-driven anthem that sounded fresh without sacrificing his signature grit. Suddenly, programmers who had written him off were spinning his name again. And younger listeners, many of whom were too young to remember the trap music era, started seeing him not as a relic, but as a veteran willing to evolve. Then came the breakthrough that pushed him back into the global mainstream blurred lines. Robin Thicke led the track. Pharrell Williams crafted the infectious groove, and T.I.'s verse added the swagger that tied the whole record together. The song dominated the Billboard Hot 100, staying at #1 for 12 straight weeks and becoming one of the most unavoidable hits of the decade. It was the kind of success that reminded the world T.I. wasn't just a regional legend. He was still capable of shaping worldwide pop culture. And crucially, it showed industry gatekeepers that he could adapt to new eras without losing himself. His momentum didn't fade. T.I. doubled down on collaborations with rising stars, proving he understood exactly where the pulse of modern hip-hop lived. His 2014 track about the money with a young thug became an anthem across the South, bridging two generations of Atlanta rap in a way few artists could pull off. Around the same time, he teamed up with Iggy Azalea on No Mediocre, a swagger-filled radio staple that kept his voice circulating in clubs and playlists nationwide. These partnerships weren't random. They were surgical. Each one placed him shoulder to shoulder with the future, signaling that his story wasn't finished, it was evolving. In the end, this phase of T.I.'s comeback wasn't about reclaiming a lost crown. It was about proving that a king who survives his own downfall can re-enter the kingdom with a new purpose. Smarter, humbler, but still powerful enough to command the room. Building the Grand Hustle Empire. After the chaos of prison and the slow, painful climb back into the public eye, T.I. made a transformative decision. If fame was fragile, then he needed to build something sturdier than popularity. Grand Hustle Records, originally born from necessity after a failed major label debut, evolved into the foundation of a true empire. What started as a scrappy independent label became his vision for long-term power, a machine capable of creating stars, not just producing songs. For many fans, especially older audiences watching his transformation from a distance, this shift felt quietly astonishing. The man once defined by controversy was now defining strategy, no longer chasing validation, but building the kind of legacy no scandal could burn down. Grand Hustle's impact didn't stay local. T.I. became a talent magnet, spotting voices that would soon reshape radio and streaming. B was one of the label's earliest breakthroughs, launching into global fame with crossover smashes that carried the Grand Hustle stamp around the world. Iggy Azalea soon followed, and under T.I.'s guidance, she reached commercial heights few expected from a newcomer with such an unconventional background for Southern hip-hop. Even a young Travis Scott passed through the Grand Hustle pipeline in his early years, sharpening the sound and aesthetic that would later make him one of the most influential artists of his generation. Each rising star proved the same truth: T.I. wasn't just surviving the industry, he was shaping its next chapter. But T.I.'s empire didn't stop with music. He expanded outward like someone determined never to depend on one source of success again. He invested in real estate, entertainment production technology ventures, restaurants, lifestyle brands, and community redevelopment. His presence in business meetings became just as important as his presence in recording studios. And over the years, public estimates of his net worth reflected that shift, consistently placing him in the tens of millions of fortune, built not by one-hit streaks, but by diversified ownership and strategic partnerships. It wasn't flash. It wasn't hype. It was a long-game approach forged from all the hard lessons of his earlier rise and fall. So when people ask what really happened to T.I., this chapter reveals one of the most surprising answers. The real shock isn't that he bounced back from prison or managed a second career revival. It's that he reinvented what success meant for himself entirely. He stopped trying to be only a star and chose instead to become an architect of artists, of businesses, of opportunities that would outlast any chart cycle. Even when the spotlight drifted to younger names, T.I. ensured he still had a kingdom, one built on ownership, mentorship, and the kind of hustle that never fades. Trap legacy and kill the king. In the years after his legal storms settled, T.I. began shaping a different kind of legacy, one less obsessed with charts and more rooted in purpose. His music matured, turning inward and outward at the same time. Gone were the days when every verse had to flex the crown of the South. In its place came a deeper voice, speaking on justice, responsibility, and the cost of choices. This was a new T.I., a man who had survived 2 prison terms, witnessed the hardest edges of fame, and now used his platform to question the world around him. His lyrics reflected not only growth, but accountability, a rare honesty that resonated with listeners who had followed his journey from the early Bankhead days. As America faced waves of social tension, he stepped forward with the clarity of someone who had lived both sides of the law, using interviews, speeches, and music to urge younger artists and younger men to break cycles he once felt trapped in. Yet while evolving personally, he also began reflecting on the genre he helped build. Long before trap took over global playlists, T.I., Jeezy, and Gucci Mane were laying its foundation brick by brick. 3 voices from the South crafting a gritty, ground-level sound that would eventually define an era. They weren't just artists, they were architects. By the 2010s, that blueprint had been picked up and electrified by a new generation. Future brought emotional darkness and melody. 2, Chainz added humor and flamboyance. Waka Flocka Flame's wild energy turned trap into mosh pit music. Then came the next wave, Young Thug bending language Migos, reshaping rap cadence with triplet flows, and artists like 21 Savage, bringing cold precision and razor-sharp realism. Every one of them, whether directly or indirectly, walked paths T.I.'s early work had cleared. That growing awareness of his influence is what led T.I. to a bold, almost poetic idea, ending his musical career on his own terms. He announced a final album, Kill the King, a title that instantly sparked curiosity. But for T.I., it wasn't a threat, it was a metaphor. The king in the title referred to the version of himself he once worshipped, the bravado, the ego, the crown he fought so hard to defend. By naming the album this way, he signaled a desire to close that chapter permanently, to step away from the myth and embrace the man. It was a moment of clarity from someone who had lived both triumph and punishment in public view. And perhaps that is the true mark of his legacy. Trap music didn't stop when T.I. stepped back. It flourished. His airs filled arenas, dominated charts, and shaped youth culture in ways early pioneers could only imagine. Yet, the fingerprints of T.I.'s early tapes, early risks, and early defiance are still embedded in the genre's DNA. His influence is not measured by weekly streams, but by the lineage of artists carrying the sound forward. If trap is a kingdom, then T.I. helped build its first walls, and Killing the King simply meant letting the next generation rule with pride, knowing the foundation beneath them was built to last. A new chapter, not a crown. In the end, the story of T.I. is not the mystery or conspiracy some might expect. It is something far more human and far more powerful. His life moves like a long, winding arc from the spotlight of glory to the shadow of mistakes into the hard reality of punishment, and finally toward the quiet, steady work of redemption. The man who once stood at the center of hip-hop culture has traded arenas and trophies for a different kind of stage, one built on wisdom, responsibility, and the courage to confront his own past. His journey reminds us that fame may rise fast, but character is rebuilt slowly, choice by choice, day by day. Today, T.I. no longer chases chart positions or global headlines. He doesn't need to. The restless fire that once drove him to claim the title King of the South has evolved into something calmer and deeper. He now leans into fatherhood, business, community work, and a life shaped by lessons most people never face so publicly. Instead of performing for millions, he invests in neighborhoods, mentors younger voices, and speaks openly about the cost of pride and the value of second chances. The world sees less of him, but those who do see a man grounded, not a myth, not a symbol, but a person who has learned to carry both his scars and his successes with grace. And maybe that is the most surprising twist of all. T.I.'s greatest comeback didn't happen on the charts, but within himself. He stepped away from the noise, let go of the crown, and embraced a quieter strength, one built on stability rather than spectacle. His legacy isn't defined solely by the trap sound he helped pioneer or the awards lining his shelves, but by the man he became after the spotlight dimmed. No longer the king, no longer the headline, T.I. stands today as something far more enduring, a survivor who transformed, a father who leads, and a man who finally found peace in being exactly who he is. In the end, T.I.'s journey forces us to confront a bigger question. What truly defines a legend, the heights they reach or the storms they survive? His life moved from triumph to turmoil and back to hard-earned peace, leaving behind a legacy built on grit, reinvention, and responsibility. But here's where the debate begins. Did T.I. step away at the right time? Or did the culture move on too quickly from one of its architects? Was he a fallen king or a man wise enough to walk off the throne on his own terms? Tell me what you believe right here on Legends of Black Excellence.